We will start with patterns of variation. And again, we have come across the two common types of variation, common cause and special cause. Common cause is inherent in every process by design. Special cause is associated with external sources of variation. But at the end, what we're measuring at the process output is the combined sum of common cause variation plus special cause variation. And again, keep in mind that, first of all, before we improve a process, we have to make sure that it is in statistical control, which means it only contains common cause variation. And second, it is very, very difficult to reduce common cause variation without interfering with the process design. So either we have to redesign the process in order to reduce common cause, or we have to add more resources. In both cases, this requires management intervention. As part of patterns of variation, we're going to talk about multi-vari analysis. And this is multivariance analysis, which is a special technique that is helping us to understand all the different types of variations in the process. So, there are three types of variation sources. Within piece, which is also known as positional variation, and these are variations within a single unit of a particular product. Piece-to-piece variation, which is also known as cyclical variation, and this is variation that occurs between the different units of the same product. We also have time to time, which is also known as temporal variation, and these are variations that occur at different points in time during production. For example, during different shifts. You may have a morning shift and you may have an afternoon shift. The good thing about multi-vari analysis and the associated tools, which are the multi-vari charts, they help us generate clues, and this is particularly useful for analyzing multiple causes of common cause variation within piece, which means within the same unit of products, piece to piece between different pieces of the same type of products over time, and also between different process streams that are producing the same type of product. For example, different production lines or different machines. So, in statistical process control, we monitor variables. And you may remember from the yellow belt training that we have two main types of variables. We have input variables, which are symbolized by using X, and output variables, which are symbolized by using Y. We also had made a distinction between the critical process inputs that are typically abbreviated with the uppercase X, and the critical process outputs abbreviated with the uppercase Ys. So when we talk about multi-vari analysis, we monitor how changes in the input variables affect the output variable. The underlying assumption is that the variables will have one representative value when they're measured and when they're analyzed. However, this is not always the case. For example, if you think about temperature, and if you think about an industrial furnace that is used in order to produce particular types of products, the temperature in the cross-section of such a furnace will vary, and this is going to have an effect on the thickness of the parts that is produced, and also it will depend on where the measurement has been taken from. Often the variation is within piece, and the source of the variation is different from part to part and from time to time variation. Now, the main tool associated with multi-vari analysis is the Multi-Vari Chart. So it is a graphical tool that we use extensively during the analyze phase of a DAMAIC, and it represents the relationship between factors like inputs as well as the response, and the response is what we call the output. We can use it when we present analysis of variance data, and we want this to be in a graphical form, which is much easier, accessible, and digestible. To view data and the possible relationships between data, as well as the causes of variation, and finally to understand if there is an interaction between input factors. Because we may have input factors that if we set them at different levels, they may interact and have a special effect on the process output. So you may have input variables that do not have an interaction between them when set at specific levels, but you may have some cases where there is an interaction. So we're very interested about understanding and identifying if and when there is interaction. This tool helps us identify the different sources of variation that I mentioned previously. It is useful for analyzing all the different types of variation, and also it helps us to investigate the stability or the consistency of a process, which is something very important, because what we try to determine is if we control the process inputs and if we set correctly the process steps between the process start and the process end, we should have predictable variation in the outputs. You should have predictable outputs and outcomes. So here we can see an example of the Multi-Vari Chart, and as you can see, it is a combination of vertical lines and different colors, and this is going to help us differentiate between, let's say, different states, different parts, different machines, etc. Regarding the anatomy of a Multi-Vari Chart, as you can see on the figure, the chart consists of a series of vertical lines or other appropriate symbols that we may be using instead of vertical lines. In many cases, we also use multiple colors. So, the length of each line, or schematic, represents the range of values that are found in its sample set. So a multi-vari chart has two axes. The horizontal axis is associated with time, so we move from left to right. And the process output, or the response measurement, is associated with the vertical axis or the y-axis. The multiple measurements of each unit are plotted together. And again, consecutive measurements are plotted from left to right. So, when we construct a multi-vari chart, we must take a number of things into consideration. First of all, the type of data that we're going to use. You must plot the effects of variation using mean values and mean indicates that we're going to be using numeric data. The factors. Speaking about factors, we're referring to the input factors or predictor factors, and we have to use a maximum of 6 inputs. In terms of levels, we have to use a minimum of each factor being set at 2 levels. It may be 0 and 1, it may be low and high, etc. And finally, the amount of data. So we collect observations for most combinations of factors. And again, here on the figure, you can see an example of a multi-vari charts and how it looks like. This is an example of a 2-factor multi-vari charts. 2 factors means that we're talking about 2 input factors, 2 predictor factors, as we call them. So an engineer at a pipe manufacturing company is concerned about the consistency in the pipe diameters. So she measures the diameters of pipes made on 2 machines, machine 1 and machine 2, as you can see on the figure, at 3 different settings each. And she creates a multi-vari charts and performs the corresponding multi-vari analysis. So, in the graphic report, the blue and red symbols represent the following characteristics. The blue symbols represent the pipe diameter means for each of the 2 machines. The red symbols represent the pipe diameters means for each setting. The variation in diameters between the machines, we can notice that it is much larger when we refer to setting 3 when compared with settings 1 and 2. That's why we say that in setting 3 we have a much longer line. There seems to be an interaction between the settings and the machines, and this obviously has to be further investigated. So when should we use this type of charts, multi-vari charts? Use them to represent analysis of variance in a graphical form. This is very, very useful, especially in the preliminary stages when we conduct data analysis. It helps view the data. It also helps establish possible relationships between data and also help us identify any root causes associated with issues. It helps the researcher to identify interaction between factors, which is another very important point in research and analysis. So an interaction occurs when the change in response from one level of a factor to another level depends upon the level of another factor. So multi-vari analysis is especially useful understanding interaction between factors, between predictor factors, i.e. the x's. Now the benefits of using this type of statistical control charts. They show most of your different types of variations. They assist you to break down the components of variation, and also they can show all measurements that have been recorded.